Good morning and welcome, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. It's my pleasure to chair this panel on fulfilling the rights of survivors from immediate responsive care to an independent, dignified life. My name is Stacey Pizzino. I'm a public health epidemiologist and PhD candidate at the University of Queensland in Australia. I am delighted to introduce the distinguished panelists for today's plenary. Dr. Hannah Wild is a general surgery resident at the University of Washington with clinical interests in trauma surgery and surgical critical care. Her research focuses on improving emergency response for civilian casualties in conflict settings. She is the lead on a partnership between the University of Washington and UNMAS to identify opportunities for synergy between humanitarian mine action and trauma care for victims of explosive weapons. Mr. Giles Dooley is the UN Global Advocate for persons with disabilities in conflict and peacebuilding situations and is a documentary photographer, writer, storyteller, and the CEO of the charity Legacy of War Foundation. Brigadier General Emmanuel Kazahera is the chair of the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention Victim Assistance Committee and works as a defence advisor to the permanent mission of Uganda to the United Nations in Geneva. He has practical military experience in emergency response in conflict settings and is keen on mitigating the effects of explosive ordnance, especially ERW, in communities. This plenary will consider two of the fundamental challenges facing direct victims of explosive ordnance. Firstly, surviving the accident. We will discuss a project between the Mine Action Area of Responsibility led by UNMAS and Humanity and Inclusion and the University of Washington. This project aims to identify opportunities for synergy between humanitarian mine action and trauma systems strengthening in affected communities. Secondly, the importance of efforts to build their lives back. When I was doing background reading to prepare for this session, I came across a quote from Giles at the 22nd NDM, and he said, "There is no point in saving a life if that person cannot access the tools to get their life back." I think this is an important point to emphasize. We need to consider the impact of injuries in terms of disability across the lifespan, and more broadly, how disability stigmatization, race, and gender influence access to services and respect for rights. In this discussion, we'll hear about experiences from the field and how challenges are being addressed. I know Mr. Kazahera will be able to provide some valuable insights from the Ugandan experience. Uganda has succeeded in developing a national comprehensive action plan on the rights of persons with disabilities that is inclusive of survivors and other persons with disabilities. As someone also passionate about this area and to contextualize this discussion, I'd like to briefly provide background. For the last few years, I've undertaken research to quantify the physical health impacts of explosive ordnance. This study, in my knowledge, is the world's largest of this type and examines over 100,000 victims across 17 countries using standard public health research methods. This research provides a deeper look at direct victims and allows us to comment on how demographic and accident characteristics impact the risk of mortality and injury. This public health lens on mine action helps to broaden our understanding of the physical health impacts of explosive ordnance and strengthens the evidence base for program planning, resource allocation, and advocacy, particularly given competing humanitarian priorities. Some findings confirm what is already known within the mine action sector, which is helpful to ensure that this knowledge is also translated and understood in other sectors, which can perhaps propose solutions. Additionally, these findings can help to ensure the mine action sector contributes to reducing mortality for those who have an accident with explosive ordnance. Case fatality is a measure of the proportion of people who die from their injuries within the total injured population. Across all the data I analysed, the collective case fatality rate was 38.8%. This means for every 100 persons in an explosive ordnance accident, almost 40 were killed, or in other words, almost 4 in 10. As shown on this slide, case fatality rates by year show an increasing trend. Increasing deaths due to explosive ordnance is also consistent with the Landmine Monitor. And this high case fatality rate highlights the importance of the trauma care interventions to reduce mortality that will be discussed in this plenary. From this study, I found that rates differ by gender and age. I found in terms of overall numbers, males suffer more in explosive events. However, females had a higher case fatality rate at 44.5% and experienced a 19% increased risk of death compared to males. This raises a few important points. From a gender perspective, why are females at a higher risk of death, and how do we increase survival rates? It also strengthens the evidence base to address these issues with robust proof that females experience a higher risk of death, which can be used for advocating for access to services and respect for rights. Regarding age, the finding was less expected. While children had increased deaths compared to adults during active conflict, overall across the collective data, children had the lower case fatality rate than adults and a 26% lower risk of death. This means in these data, children are surviving more than adults comparatively, but this increased survivorship for such a young group raises the importance of considering disability across the lifespan. Considering the circumstances that led to death, certain activities and factors at the time of accident showed an increased risk of death. These were traveling with a 33% increased risk of death, being involved in active conflict, and that is both as a combatant, as a civilian combatant, and during active conflict contamination with a 22% increased risk of death, and being a bystander to an accident, also with a 22% increased risk of death compared to foraging. For children, when compared with adults, exposure to active conflict led to an 84% increased risk, playing a 49% increased risk, and being a bystander showed a 43% increased risk. I also looked more explicitly at injuries, and generally injury data was only available for survivors. So I caveat that these do not represent injuries that led to death, as these data were not widely collected. For survivors, injuries appeared as follows. For the whole population, lower limb injuries were the most common, with 38.3% of injuries occurring in this region. This occurred for both males and females. Females also showed increased upper limb injuries compared to males, with 25.8% of injuries occurring in this region in females. Trauma distribution for children, however, showed a different pattern, with upper limbs and lower limbs almost equally affected. This distribution of injuries likely reflects survivorship. For example, most chest and abdominal injuries are not salvageable with current care. Insights regarding disability in these data are unknown. We don't know here the duration of these injuries beyond the immediate event or the severity of the injuries in terms of trauma scoring. We also don't know whether a casualty had a pre-existing impairment, as to date, casualty data is not disaggregated by disability a person may have had prior to the accident. And this makes it difficult to understand how different types of impairment affect a person's risk of having an EO accident. And consequently, we cannot be disability inclusive in interventions, program planning, or priority setting. I'd like to emphasize here that the implementation of IMAS 1310 and also the minimum data standards related to victims that are included in IMAS 510 Annex B would work to address these knowledge gaps. I think further from this, partnering with health actors and academia can help to analyse and provide innovative solutions, targeted medical services, and to strengthen the evidence base for advocacy and program planning. Moving on now to our panel discussion. This will be structured through a Q&A with a series of questions that I will direct to the panel. I'd like to first give the floor to Dr. Wild to discuss how we can address this mortality. Dr. Wild, the data shows death increasing for victims of explosive ordnance, making it all the more pertinent to ask the question, how do we increase survival rates?
Thank you, Ms. Piscino. When I met Christelle through her role as the Mine Action Area of Responsibility Deputy Coordinator, she posed the question to me, what would it take to reduce mortality among victims of explosive ordnance from 1 in 3 to 1 in 10? This challenge was framed with the understanding that interventions would need to be affordable, effective, and feasible to be supported by mine action stakeholders in low resource settings. Motivated by the goals of the MA-AOR to work outside of silos, we decided to leverage a new partnership between our Level 1 Trauma Center at a US-based academic department of surgery with UNMAS to try and answer this question. When we talk about preventable deaths from explosive ordnance, for many of you in this audience as mine action operators, preventable death actually has a definition that is broader than it does for me and my colleagues as surgeons and trauma care providers. From the lens of mine action, any death caused by explosive ordnance is preventable, and that is why your work on clearance is so critically important. From the lens of trauma care, a death caused by catastrophic injuries immediately upon impact would not be considered preventable. But the patient who was injured and died because they had bleeding from an extremity that was not properly controlled, or a penetrating chest wound that could not reach care in time to get a chest tube, that is a preventable death, and that is what I'm here to discuss today. Returning to the question, how do we reduce preventable death among victims of explosive ordnance? In the simplest possible terms, by bringing immediate life-saving care closer to the patient, by bringing the patient to a trained care provider faster, and by improving the quality of care rendered to the patient. Next. Although the setting and resource constraints are dramatically different, the approach used by the US military to revolutionize casualty care actually provides a conceptual map. Throughout the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US military conducted ongoing reviews of all preventable deaths and published it under this exact title, Eliminating Preventable Death on the Battlefield. They found that these deaths were largely due to uncontrolled bleeding and to a lesser extent breathing emergencies. To address this, the US military trauma system underwent sequential improvements to create a continuum of casualty care from the point of injury to definitive treatment at a health facility. This includes measures you may have heard of, such as tactical combat casualty care, which is life-saving trauma care for all military personnel, even those without a medical background, as well as the well-known golden hour policy for urgent transport of casualties, and clinical advances such as the use of hemostatic agents in whole blood. Together, these changes resulted in historically low death rates with an approximately 45% mortality reduction over the course of these wars. Of course, this approach is not directly translatable to low resource settings, but even in settings where resources are limited and formal trauma systems do not exist, it is possible to translate many core components of these systems to improve casualty care. To identify how this framework could be translated to low resource settings, we undertook 2 phases of background research. This research adopted a pragmatic approach, trying to answer 2 basic questions. 1, what interventions work in this context? And 2, what opportunities exist within the mine action sector to implement and scale these interventions? To answer the first question, we conducted a systematic review of the literature on all trauma care interventions in low resource settings, and performed a synthesis of nearly 150 reports, identifying the interventions with the strongest evidence for reducing preventable deaths. We then organized those interventions along a continuum of care by phase, from layperson first response, 2, pre-hospital, and 3, health facility. To answer the second question, we conducted nearly 20 expert interviews with experts within the sector to explore how these interventions to strengthen trauma care for civilians could potentially fit into the framework of mine action. We identified key themes around facilitators and barriers to implementation of these interventions. Weaving together the results from these 2 strategies, we then developed the Civilian Casualty Care Chain, or CCCC. Next, please. Like more formal trauma systems, the CCCC, when you have the opportunity to advance, encompasses a continuum of care from the point of injury to definitive care at a health facility. We selected 2 key interventions at each phase based on feasibility and demonstrated efficacy, with training as a core pillar at each phase. At the layperson phase, interventions included layperson first responder training, as well as layperson transport systems. At the pre-hospital phase, interventions include pre-hospital trauma training as well as pre-hospital notification systems. The purpose of pre-hospital notification systems is to alert health facilities of incoming casualties. As simple as it sounds, even in high-resource settings, this is one of the trauma systems components that has been demonstrated to have the most significant impact on deaths. At the facility-based phase, interventions focus on bringing better care to the patient with more advanced trauma care trainings, including specialized modules on pediatrics, meaning the care of children, and blast-specific injuries like burns or complex orthopedic injuries, as well as trauma team organization and activation systems. That means working with emergency health personnel to create organized trauma teams with designated roles during the evaluation and resuscitation of a casualty upon arrival at a health facility and mechanisms to activate this team. Throughout the framework, data collection and quality improvement are continuous threads. As the mine action sector's important efforts focused on clearance and implementation of the Mine Ban Treaty continue, until a world free of explosive ordnance can be achieved, it is critical we partner to do everything possible to reduce preventable deaths. The civilian casualty care chain highlights that even in the absence of formal trauma systems, evidence-based interventions exist that can reduce mortality from explosive ordnance. Precisely how this framework is put into practice is highly context-specific, and later in today's panel, we will have the opportunity to discuss considerations around implementation in greater detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wild. Thank you for outlining your approach to reducing preventable deaths. By how much could such a framework decrease mortality?
Thank you. And next slide, please. As an integrated framework, the CCCC has the potential to reduce mortality by 68%. This gets us very close to the number posed to me by Christelle and could reduce deaths among casualties of explosive ordnance from 1 in 3 to 1 in 10. I need to thank a brilliant colleague for the modeling behind this estimate, Ben Wynn, a data scientist who previously worked for the WHO and MSF. Dr. Wynn used the results of our literature review and ranges of estimated effectiveness for each intervention to simulate mortality reduction potential. This was done both by phase of care, by individual intervention, as well as across the entire chain of care. For future directions of this work, we will be able to use causal models to predict the mortality reduction potential of interventions targeting specific injury types related to blast mechanisms. For example, one study we identified demonstrated that early surgical intervention for burn patients in Malawi reduced mortality or deaths from 30 to 3%. By modeling, we can estimate the potential impact of adding training content focused on burn management. This is just one example of the way that modeling can help support advocacy. Thank you.
68% reduction, that is significant. Can you speak to interventions that have been attempted previously, both in the context of mine action and in other fields? What is known about what it takes for such interventions to demonstrate sustainable uptake?
Certainly, and we can pause on the following slide. Perhaps the estimate of 60% mortality reduction potential sounds high, but when you consider that one previous intervention alone reduced mortality by over 60%, this is actually not surprising, or if anything, our estimate was conservative. The intervention to which I'm referring may be familiar to individuals in the audience. It is the Village University Training Program conducted by the Tromso Mine Victim Center in Cambodia and Iraq in the late 1990s. Briefly, an intensive trauma training was provided to networks of lay first responders as well as paramedics. In a high-quality prospective study conducted over 5 years, it was found that in areas where this intervention was deployed, mortality among trauma victims was reduced from 40% to about 15%. So why are we having this conversation today? Why isn't this just done everywhere? The question that we really have to ask and answer today is, how can it be that even highly effective interventions may not stick, so to speak? The main issue is not developing new effective interventions. The issue is implementing, disseminating, and scaling them in a sustainable way. We need to understand what it takes for interventions to become an integrated part of larger systems and outlive any single program or person. One potential lens to understand this is an analysis we did in 2020 of the WHO Trauma Care Checklist, looking at facilitators and barriers to uptake in low resource settings. Some of the key themes that emerged were the importance of context-specific adaptation, integration of the checklist with existing systems and clinical practices, and having a designated institutional advocate of the initiative. In the future, on our end in academia, partnership with specialists in implementation science can ensure these considerations remain a priority. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. I agree with implementing and disseminating and scaling in a sustainable way. What data exists for the cost efficacy of these interventions, and what are the research gaps in this domain?
We need an entire side event to answer this question. There are so many opportunities to improve the evidence base on trauma care in low resource settings. But to focus my response, I will say that although cost efficacy remains a research gap, what data do exist suggests that these interventions are highly cost effective. The Disease Control Priorities Project, abbreviated as DCP, is a multi-year project establishing priority setting for implementation of universal healthcare packages in low and middle income countries. Cost effectiveness analyses from the DCP3 estimated that the cost per life year gained by training layperson first responders and paramedics is $7. 7. To contextualize this for you, among other interventions, HIV testing is often considered to have a favorable cost efficacy profile and has, in certain contexts, hundreds of dollars per life year gained. With respect to research gaps, I can provide examples around clinical controversies, for example, the appropriateness of tourniquet application in various settings with prolonged pre-hospital times, or translation of casualty care in higher resourced settings. But these are aspirational targets when the potential impacts of basic first aid training among affected communities haven't been fully realized. There's so much to do in this area, but by supporting a coordinated framework for civilian casualty care, the infrastructure to explore these questions can gradually be developed. One of the many exciting things about the prospect of collaborating with the mine action sector as an implementing partner is the incredibly strong practice of data collection that already exists, thanks to the information management standards in your field. This precedent for standardized data collection creates unique opportunities for high quality monitoring and evaluation of any proposed interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wild. I'd like to pose the next question to all the panelists. What about survivors? Victims live in a larger context where race, gender, stigmatization of persons with disabilities may all dictate access to care and respect for rights. How do we increase the respect for rights of EO survivors? Mr. Kazahara, would you like to share your experience in Uganda?
Thank you, Hannah. How do we increase respect for the rights of survivors? This is a big question because it spans a period and involves the environment, the history of your country. For example, Uganda. Uganda has gone through a conflict and there were landmines and other explosive weapons, remnants of weapons, and thereby currently we have 2,500 victims from landmines as landmine survivors. Now, to restore the confidence of somebody who has been injured, a victim of a landmine, must involve response for treatment, the kind of treatment, if there is any requirement for prosthetics, he has lost a leg or an arm or something, then there must be processes that put this individual in a confident state to feel that he still lives as originally when he was never injured. And so the government has put in place some policy frameworks after studying the situation and working at the national level with the lower authorities and international policies, international partners, to ensure that we work together to restore confidence and increase the respect for mine survivors. Example is the National Action Plan, which is a strategic document for the rights of people with disabilities. And it is an inclusive document that talks about, includes the victims. And its objectives is to strengthen coordination of mechanisms for disability inclusive programs and implementation, as well as monitoring and reporting what activities. It also enhances the capacity of ministries, departments, and agencies to ensure that the budgeting focuses on the disability. The disability percentage is around 12.4%, and by act of parliament, there are representatives at different levels. There is a portion, a percentage at the local level up to the national level, representatives in the political space, to ensure the victims also get an opportunity to talk about their rights and their heard. There is by an act of parliament, there is an equal opportunities commission, which was established to audit the MDAs to ensure that the persons with disabilities access education, health, and all the factors to ensure that everybody lives in a respectable and dignified life. And annually, there is an audit report for all the MDAs to show that this ministry has not reached the percentage as required by the government to ensure that the people with disabilities have been included in the programs. We have rehabilitation centers. For example, we have a military rehabilitation center in central Uganda. It's called Mubende. And from the field, the officers or soldiers are put into that rehabilitation center. They are treated, provided with the prosthetics and all the other things, and also given skills to make sure that since they are disabled, they are reintegrated in society and can be able to earn and fend for their families. And other areas include the national health policy, which also treats people, responds to an incident without discrimination, that somebody was already a victim of landmines or explosive ordnance or not. And so I think that is mostly that area. And in accordance with the National Action Plan on People with Disabilities was formulated with the support of the European Union and the Implementation Support Unit of the Anti-Personnel Man-Ban Convention. So collaboration with different stakeholders helps also in maybe financing, in sharing ideas, and once it is developed, it can also be shared with other countries within the region and work together. And then in accordance with UNMAS, which guided in the other articles like 13.10, which is on victim assistance, and it actually gives guidance to mine action authorities and centers on what the roles and responsibilities are in regard to supporting government entities in providing victim assistance as to meet the needs and the rights of victims. So different interventions help create confidence reduce stigmatization, because if you are a lawyer and you are disabled and you are able to represent and win, you are supported and you win a case, you'll be respected in society. And other victims will be encouraged to study. They will not be hampered by the disability. So generally, that is some of the experience. We'll have more discussion, but I think the time cannot allow us. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Kazahara, for sharing your experience in Uganda and how Uganda has targeted vulnerable groups. Giles, could you please share your views?
Good morning, everybody. Somebody asked me recently how you become a successful CEO of an organization. And I said, well, surround yourself by brilliant people and let them be brilliant. And I feel like that on the panel today, surrounded by incredibly brilliant people who are bringing great insight and knowledge and research. I am a simple storyteller. My work comes from just being in the field. I was sitting here thinking about stories connected with stigma. And I realized that next year it will be 20 years since I first visited a demining project, 20 years of visiting hundreds of projects, hundreds of hospitals where casualties have arrived, thousands of families where I've sat and listened to their stories. And it breaks my heart to think of people that I met 20 years ago as children and wondering what their life has become, realizing their journey and how difficult that has been. Children I met at 7, 8 years old who are now nearly 30, and I wonder what happened to them. And I realized that in many ways, in that 20 years of documenting people injured by conflict and especially by landmines, nothing really has changed for them. Stigma is an interesting word. I mean, I think we should start by realizing that in the majority of situations we're talking about, the people injured already come from marginalized communities. They tend to come from poorer backgrounds, less educated. So already the cards are stacked against them. But I want to talk about something slightly different, which is what I would call self-stigmatization. Because one of the things we don't talk a lot about, and everybody knows about the societal community stigmatization, but I find actually often when I'm with landmine survivors, you realize that much of their fear, much of what's holding them back is their own stigmatization. I'll give you an example. Sometimes it can be very unusual, surprising context that we won't understand unless we really sit and listen to people. A young boy I met in Mosul who had lost an arm to an unexploded bomb, and he wouldn't go outside. Everybody had assumed it was because he thought he was embarrassed about his missing arm. After spending a few days with him, I actually discovered it was because he thought that people would think he'd had his arm cut off for being a thief by ISIS. And that's why he was scared to go out. Now, that's just one example. A woman I met who works as a cleaner in the emergency hospital in Kabul who had lost a leg. Somebody had offered to get married to her, and she had turned him down because she felt embarrassed about her leg and felt she wouldn't be a good enough wife, even though he constantly tried to persuade her and desperately was in love with her. But she kept saying no because she felt she would let him down. Recently, I was in Gaza working with amputees from blast injuries. I met a young boy called Amro. Amro had not left his house. He was only 19 years old, but he'd not left his house in 3 years because he was embarrassed about his prosthetic. And he thought, what would people think of when they look at me? If you imagine a young boy, 19 years old, too scared to leave his house. I mean, I pointed out to him, if he went out and had a coffee with me, there was much more chance people would be staring at the white triple amputee than him, and I would distract him. And we did. We went out and had a coffee, and I saw him laugh and relax. And since then, he's actually got a job in a coffee shop. So it was a simple case of him getting over his self-stigma. So I think that's something we have to understand and has to be part of this framework is the psychological support for people injured. by landmines, people who are left with long-term disability. It's something that's often missing in this conversation. The surgical intervention obviously is incredibly important. I would also add into the surgical intervention, it's very important that the understanding of the specific needs of blast injuries and amputations is taken into that consideration. Because again, time and time, I have met people where I've been told if the surgery had been done slightly differently, their chances of walking, their chances of using prosthesis would be completely different. So we have to put that into this framework. But as I say, we have to include the psychological challenge. And one other thing I wanted to add is who deals best with traumatic injury from landmines? And I was sitting here thinking about this. As I said, I've met so many people over the years, and I realized that there's probably two groups of people that adapt best. One are children. As we know, children are incredibly resilient and bounce back. And the second group is people who are married, stable with children in their family homes. The people I've discovered who struggle the most to rebuild their lives are those in that transition from childhood to having their own families, to building their own life, building their own identity. And often they are the largest kind of proportion of people injured. So what is it that gives them the strength? And it's love. It's being in a framework of love. As a child, it's often the parents that carry the greatest concern of what will happen to my child when they grow. Will somebody want to marry them? Will they be able to work? When somebody is married and has children, again, they're often supported by their own family network. So when we talk about getting rid of stigma, it sounds very corny, but one of the things we have to let people know is that despite their injuries, despite everything they've been through, despite the self-stigmatization, despite the fact that the community may shun them, despite the fact they may think they have no value because they can't work, they have to know that they can still be loved. They have to know that they have a future that is surrounded by love and support. And you would not believe the amount of times young men in their 20s have privately broken down to me and cried and said, actually, their greatest fear is not what everyone talks about. It's the simple question, will anyone love me? And so as part of this framework, it's important that we help people rebuild their lives, not just through surgery, not just through physiotherapy, prosthetics, support of the right wheelchairs, but also psychologically, to make people know that despite their injuries, they have a life ahead. We can give them microfinance, we can help them get them businesses, but importantly, that they are still loved.
Thank you. That's powerful statements. And I agree the importance of psychosocial support and mental health, which I think was covered earlier this week at the APMBC. Dr. Wild, do you want to add anything?
I appreciate my co-panelists' comments, which have contextualized their responses from extensive field experience. I'll keep my comments brief. I merely wish to highlight that, no slide necessary, thank you, that gender disparities have been demonstrated to exist in numerous fragile and conflict-affected settings, as was supported by Ms. Pizzino's research and other comments provided today. Surgical colleagues at Stanford conducted an analysis of all surgeries performed at Médecins Sans Frontières projects in conflict settings, and even adjusting for the fact that men were seen more frequently at these facilities, women were 2 times less likely in certain situations to actually receive a needed surgery. And women were more likely to have to undergo surgery because of harm that occurred to them from non-standard medical practices, suggesting significant delays or barriers to receiving care at health facilities. The factors that drive these disparities are not fully understood, but it really highlights the fact that when we propose any framework of interventions, it's critical to work with local communities to understand the cultural acceptability of trauma care practices and ensure that they can reach all individuals equitably. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Circling back to mortality, the CCCC that you presented encompasses an entire continuum of care from point of injury to definitive care at the health facility. Dr. Wild, can you explain the concept of the civilian casualty care chain, what it means in practice?
Yes, thank you. One of the key objectives of this work is to identify underutilized opportunities for synergy between humanitarian mine action and existing initiatives in emergency health response. While responsibility for the emergency response to civilian casualties ultimately lies with local and multilateral health authorities like the WHO, the mine action community has a longstanding presence in hard-to-reach conflict-affected settings. By acting as an implementing partner, mine action operators can significantly extend the reach of trauma response initiatives, yet at present, there is limited coordination between these sectors. On a broad level, these opportunities have been highlighted by the Joint Operational Framework on Health and Protection, but the civilian casualty care chain represents a concrete opportunity to put this cooperation into practice. The measures proposed in the CCCC interface with, but in no way supplant, broader initiatives such as the WHO Emergency Care System Framework. The CCCC consists of interventions that A, support that framework, yet B, can also be feasibly supported by mine action operators. Although it is designed as a continuum of care, implementation can be approached in a stepwise manner. And depending on factors including local needs and capabilities, as well as mine action operators' relationships with communities and local health officials, any one intervention can be taken as a starting point. Implementation strategies will all require long-term engagement from local partners and must include baseline needs assessments to ensure that they are context appropriate. Numerous concrete opportunities for implementation were identified by our expert interviews, and I will highlight only a few. At the layperson first response phase, experts we interviewed identified explosive ordnance risk education activities and community liaisons as a potential implementing partner for layperson first responder trainings. Specifically, it was discussed that networks for community engagement established through EORE activities could be used to provide layperson training in life-saving trauma care in a train-the-trainer model. Interview participants also identified mine action medics in certain settings as a potential focus of implementation strategies. Understanding that their primary responsibility is to be present at a worksite to support clearance activities, creative strategies were suggested by our interviewees and ranged from holding trauma trainings at a safe periphery from a worksite, or if additional funding were obtained through collaborative consortium proposals, after hours in communities or with local pre-hospital personnel. Regarding pre-hospital notification systems, numerous opportunities were identified to improve coordination and cooperation between mine action operators and the emergency health sector. These strategies focused specifically around eliminating duplicative work streams done in parallel both by multilateral health organizations and separately by mine action operators to maintain updated information on local health capacity and to notify affected communities around the appropriate pathways to seek emergency medical care. These are just several examples, and I provide them with a humble understanding that there is wide variation not only by local context, but also in the structure and organization of medical teams within each mine action organization. Nonetheless, tightening linkages between mine action and emergency health response can be mutually beneficial and have the potential to dramatically reduce deaths. Thank you.
Concretely, what are the first steps in implementation of the CCCC?
For multiple reasons, we are recommending a stepwise implementation strategy, starting with layperson first responder trainings. This intervention, number one, has the highest demonstrated mortality reduction potential. 2, is thought to be the most cost-effective. And 3, relative to interventions at the health facility level, the landscape of stakeholders is somewhat less complex. Ideally, several sites and implementing partners within the mine action community can be identified to conduct case studies during this pilot phase. Depending on the context and on the structure of the partnering mine action operators' medical teams, These layperson first responder trainings could be delivered either through integration with EURE platforms or by demining medics. With respect to the target population, these trainings can focus on individuals including general members of the community, commercial drivers, and police officers. The training of commercial drivers in life-saving care is a particular priority given that in the current state, many victims of explosive ordnance are brought to care by private transport. By doing so, this would also provide a natural pathway to support organization of layperson transport systems. With respect to the content of the training, as you know, a wide range of materials exist. I'm very pleased to share that there has been a resoundingly positive response from actors in emergency health to these discussions. Specifically, we have identified opportunities to collaborate with the World Health Organization by acting as implementing partners for the WHO's Community First Aid Responder, or CFAR trainings, including its conflict-specific curriculum, and for the WHO to act as a technical advisor for these efforts. In addition, we have held preliminary discussions with the leadership of the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma and their Stop the Bleed program, with preliminary support for collaborative efforts to provide Stop the Bleed trainings in communities affected by explosive ordnance. These collaborations are just a first step, but hold potential to open the door for future opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wild, for outlining those steps. Giles, can I get you to comment on this and perhaps the role of the mine action community?
Yeah, I mean, I often come to conferences, and I hear many great solutions and ideas like the CCCC. At the end of the day, I walk away though thinking it's about the will of actually implementing those things. I know many of us are held back by donors, by funds. You know, this is, at the end of the day, is always the bottom line. I'll give you an example. Somebody injured, 40 years old, working in Afghanistan with American troops, stepped on a landmine, lost both legs. Within 5 minutes, had tourniquets on by the American medics. Within 10 minutes, was on a medevac helicopter, was flown to Kandahar, one of the best hospitals you could possibly be in the world, was given the best treatment anybody could receive. A 7-year-old boy lost both legs to a landmine walking to school just a few miles away. His family managed to get him to the American base, where they declined to help him. They refused to use their medevac helicopter. His family had to drive him in the back of a taxi for 36 hours to get him to the emergency hospital in Kabul. The staff that attended him there would say, we know the people that get here with these injuries always survive, because the fact they've made it this far means that they are at that point. Now, that boy was called Atola. I was the other person that was injured. We were injured about a week apart from each other, just a few miles away from each other. Now, I'm not saying that I expect every country and every team to have the full kind of, resources of the US military. But the fact is, we know these systems are possible. That's the reality. So although it's great to have the CCC and all these other implementations, we have to find a way to make it work. Everybody here either works or has visited a demining project. One of the first things you'll do on that visit is have a health and safety briefing. We will be shown exactly what will happen when somebody from the team is injured. There'll be a breakdown of that care, how quickly they'll be medevaced or taken to a hospital, where that hospital would be. I'm always impressed by the level of detail in that. I've asked many times, what would happen if somebody in the community was injured in the same way? Would they receive the same support? And I think many of us know, unfortunately, the answer is no, because that's not how it's set up. So we know the system is there. It's how we actually find a way to implement it. Now, I'm not saying all the pressure and all the responsibility has to go onto the demining community. And yet, the reality is, often in these situations, the demining community is the most organized organization there. They are the best point of contact to begin that process. So I do think there is a responsibility. I do think there is a need to look and say, okay, this is how we would support our team member if they were injured. How would we support a member of the community? The skills are there. The knowledge is there. And I think we have to share that with the community when people are injured at that point of contact in a remote area, who is better equipped to get them the CCCC than the demining community working there.
Thank you for highlighting the reality for communities. Mr. Kazahara, so at the community level, how do community level or first responder interventions fit into the broader continuum of care from that point of injury to the facility level and beyond?
Thank you. In the normal circumstances, it looks very easy because the community is there, the roads are there, and the hospitals are there. But the best example would be hard to reach areas. You find yourself in a mountain, you find yourself in a place which does not have a road. And the road may be there, but the ambulance cannot go there, or even the ambulance is not there. So the community, the ability to bring together the community is the main effort of responding to a victim. And in the case of Uganda, we found when there is a problem, you look for a solution. And not everybody in the community, in the villages, is educated. But there are some people who have reached a certain level and have been exposed to first aid. And they train, like the Uganda Red Cross in coordination with the International Red Cross, coordinate and provide first aid in schools, in different communities. And then there is self-saving system where you find that if an incident happens, some people are quick to respond. And then some people, those people are identified and given more training to respond to different emergencies. This started with pregnancies, responding to women, because that is also another serious emergency. And with the declaration of end of mines, mine-free Uganda in 2012, so a few explosive emergencies happen from time to time. So the other thing is about the awareness, the mine risk education, where you find in churches, in sports galas, radio talk shows, you find there are vans which move around with megaphones and telling people if they hear an incident has happened in other places, they try and make sure our people are also informed. That means it activates even the volunteers, and these are the people they call village health teams. They have basic knowledge and are able to communicate with the police. If it is an explosion, they talk, they communicate with the anti-terrorism police or joint task force, and then those are primary health caregivers. They provide the first aid, they communicate to the police, and a little bit the higher authorities, the health system, to prepare for receiving the emergency. And at the end of the day, if there is no transport, there are volunteers who provide. But the leaders within the society and the associations of some of the mine victims fight to get transport so that we do not have more incidents. So the basic means of transport can be a tricycle. I hope you know what a tricycle is. And it moves from which village and goes to the basic, the village, it's called Health Center 1, where it is managed by a nurse. And it could go to the next level until the system of medical is done. But the importance of the community members in mobilizing awareness and those with basic first aid links the incident to the main health system. And actually, in other words, they also say living in a community with discipline would help you that if we are 4 people and we find somebody, we are all injured, they might respond to the one who also supports the. So the community has a social responsibility of working together. And when we go to the higher level, then that is a big thing about the Office of the Prime Minister, a disaster preparedness, and that is on a large scale. But for a community level and a small event or a few areas, the community participation is critical into delivering an emergency into a health system. Thank you.
While it has now become evident that the humanitarian mine action community should play a greater role in providing trauma care, what initiatives exist that are driven by the WHO or other multilateral health organizations? And how can the mine action sector ensure benefits also spread to explosive ordnance contaminated areas? Dr. Wild, can I give you the floor?
Brigadier General Kazahura's remarks highlight perfectly the linkages between emergency care, whether that be for victims of explosive ordnance or obstetric emergencies. I'll keep my remarks brief with an eye on the time, but the primary initiative in this domain I want to highlight is the World Health Organization's ECO resolution, which was just adopted at the 76th World Health Assembly at the end of May. ECO stands for Emergency, Critical, and Operative Care. While the resolution's aims are far-reaching, the point for this audience is its integrated approach to the provision of life-saving emergency health services to populations in need. In keeping with the themes discussed today around diversity and inclusion, explicitly focusing on marginalized and hard-to-reach groups. The resolution highlights the fact that in low-resource settings and complex environments, emergency, critical, and operative care are interdependent and cross-disciplines. And there's task shifting, meaning no single guild of health professionals is responsible for any given domain of care. For example, a general practitioner may be helping to perform an emergency procedure. Of particular relevance to today's plenary is the 7th call to member states laid out by the ECO resolution, urging the promotion of innovative ways for community engagement in the design and delivery of emergency, critical, and operative care services, including community education on early recognition, care seeking, and first aid, training for first responders, and structured mechanisms for incorporating community perspectives in strategic planning and monitoring of implementation. The initiatives that we're discussing today and that already exist in some of the contexts described by Brigadier General Kazahura would poise the mine action community as a leader in implementation of this resolution. And by demonstrating this potential impact is a perfect opportunity to begin a synergy between these sectors. Thank you.
Mr. Kazahura, can I direct this question to you as well? How can the mine action sector ensure benefits also spread to EO contaminated areas?
The marking of hazardous areas is critical in protecting everybody. In military operations, for example, even when those days landmines were used, they would mark the area because it can end up hitting your own troops. And so with UNMAS standards, which guide on like national mine action authorities and centers on how to handle, because the National Mine Action Center authorities have their national guidelines. The UNMAS supports the states to ensure that across the globe, we are working according to standards. And when you come to work in Uganda, for example, and you hear there is a mine area, you will not be scared to follow the guidelines of the nation. And for example, UNMAS 5.1 is guidance on marking explosive hazard areas, which is provided in 8.4 on the national standards and organization SOPs to provide guidance for directions for markings inside buildings. And there are others that also guide the national mine action centers and authorities to ensure we move according to SOPs and we increase safety. 13.10 in victim assistance and outlines guidelines regarding victim assistance and describes the roles and responsibilities of the national mine action authorities and centers in working to support relevant government entities to coordinate and provide victim assistance to meet the needs and address the rights of explosive ordnance victims. So we need to work in coordination to improve safety and improve other areas that make the victims live a good life. Thank you.
Today's plenary has considered two of the fundamental challenges facing direct victims of explosive ordnance: surviving the accident and building back lives. From the varying perspectives of academia, health, policy, and advocacy, the panel all agreed that the mine action sector should contribute further to reduce mortality and on the importance of efforts to build back lives. Several recommendations have arisen from this discussion, and I'd like to highlight these key messages. Firstly, information management is vital. We need to ensure disaggregated data is collected and that analyses on casualties are undertaken to identify areas where emergency response can be strengthened, to help inform explosive ordnance risk education, and to ensure the needs of survivors are met across the lifespan. It's difficult to address issues when the magnitude of the problem is not clearly comprehended, particularly for those beyond the mine action sector who may be able to propose solutions. For example, sharing these data with health actors can help with the targeted provision of medical care. This can also assist with monitoring and sharing of innovation in health practices relevant to mine action. Secondly, we need to strengthen the local response by medics. As Dr. Wild highlighted, in line with Action 36 in the Oslo Action Plan, the mine action sector can partner with trauma care providers to reduce the mortality rate of explosive ordnance victims by training EORE community liaison, deminers, and medics to train layperson first responders. Specifically, Dr. Wild recommended the mine action sector acts as implementing partners for the WHO's CFAR training. Thirdly, we need to strengthen the role of the mine action sector in policy. This can be achieved by promoting the development of national mine action standards on victim assistance in mine action and by implementing UNMAS 1310. This includes reaching out to actors responsible for providing emergency medical services, promoting implementation in those areas with increased deaths, participating in interministerial and multi-stakeholder coordination mechanisms, and the development of national action plans that ensure services needed are being programmed and budgeted for. Finally, in addition to this, we need advocacy on the rights of persons with disabilities in line with the CRPD. We have a few minutes for interventions and questions before I would like to hand the floor to Giles to reflect on what we've discussed here. If you have any questions or statements from the floor, if you'd like to raise your plaque. Do we have? I can't see who it is. UNDP, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. My name is Keiko, working independent consultant, especially working at victim assistance for the UNDP. Thank you so much for the panel, especially for the General Kazunuha. He emphasized the importance of the community engagement, and all the intervention was great, but it's also made me think mine action sector doing a great work. The one thing we don't do so well is try to talk to the other people. For example, a lot of work was done on a disaster risk reduction. So EO is one of the risk reduction, right? And then the rest of the survey action has been done how to mitigate risk of the disaster. So it has been identified 4 elements: risk knowledge, and then detection of the risk, and then response capacity, and then communication dissemination. Within the my action, we do a lot of the risk reduction, risk education, we do the detection, and then we do the communication, but we probably don't do enough for building a response capacity, which already talked today quite a lot. So one of the typical sample of the response capacity is training, having a plan, and then simulation exercise in the community, and then having a cash in your pocket. So if you need a quick evacuation, people have a money to take the action. So that is some of the example, a lot of the work already done in regard to risk reduction, which probably my action actor, you don't have to panic, you don't have to do from the scratch, but systems already exist in the community, so which you just can try to coordinate and then add it on. So this is my small contribution. And then on top of that, I also like to highlight community response capacity could include the peer support, which Jill was talking about, how you're going to overcome initial shock and then trauma. So all this previous EO victim could be your first point of the contact, part of the planning, training, simulation. The community is probably ready before they have accident. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing. Is there anyone else who'd like to say anything? I can see. We've got 2. Oh, okay. Is that at the back? I don't know. I can't see who, but you have the floor.
That one? Thank you. Yes, Suzanne Federline from James Madison University from the Center for International Stabilization and Recovery. And I really think this is a wonderful panel, and Dr. Wild's research, I think, has been very useful in drawing attention to the medical aspect of the response. But I want to just indicate that Giles Dooley's work and the importance of psychosocial rehabilitation and peer support work, going back to the early days of the Landmine Survivors Network, and the importance of making those human connections and the role that plays in recovery. And just wonder if we could address that a little bit more in this. I know it was taken up earlier in the week, but I think it has a very important aspect to play in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very important point. And on that note, I actually would like to, oh, sorry, we have one more question. 2 more questions. You have the floor.
تعليق وليس سؤال. أنا المقدم دخاخنا عزيز ممثل وزارة الدفاع بالجزائر. سيدة الرئيسة، شكرا جزيلا. بما أن هذه هي المرة الأولى التي يتناول فيها الوفد الجزائري الكلمة، أود بالتوجه بخالص الشكر إلى كل القائمين على تنظيم هذا الاجتماع، وإلى البلد المضيف سويسرا على استضافة هذا الحدث الهام. والشكر موصول للمحاضرات والمحاضرين على مداخلاتهم القيمة حول موضوع محوري وجوهري، ألا وهو مساعدة الضحايا والناجين من الألغام. وللمشاركة في النقاش التفاعلي أود أن أشير إلى أهمية المقاربة الشاملة التي كرستها خطة عمل أوسلو بخصوص إدراج مساعدة الضحايا في إطار واسع وأشمل يتضمن حقوق الإنسان ذوي الإعاقة. أو حقوق الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة. وفي هذا السياق عبر المشاركون في الملتقى الدولي الإفريقي الذي نظمته الجزائر بمشاركة وحدة تنفيذ اتفاقية حظر الألغام المضادة للأفراد بالجزائر العاصمة يومي 30-31 ماي 2023 عن ضرورة الاستجابة للاحتياجات غير الملباة لضحايا الألغام المضادة للأفراد من خلال نهج قائم على حقوق الإنسان بما يتماشى مع اتفاقية حقوق الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة والمعايير والمبادئ التوجيهية الدولية بما في ذلك خطة عمل أوسلو. وكما أن الأعمال المتعلقة بمكافحة الألغام لا يمكن أن تنتظر، فإن مساعدة الضحايا على وجه الخصوص لا يمكنها أيضا أن تنتظر. وتحسبا لمؤتمر المراجعة الخامسة لاتفاقية حظر الألغام المضادة للأفراد سنة 2024 يتعين العمل على إعادة حشد وتعبئة الموارد المخصصة لهذه الركيزة الأساسية لمكافحة الألغام، والتي تأثرت كثيرا بجائحة كوفيد-19 بشكل معتبر، مع أنه خلال الجائحة لم تتوقف الألغام عن حصد الأرواح وتخليف المزيد من الضحايا. ختاما، أرجو أن يشاطرنا المحاضرون أفكارهم بخصوص النقاط التي أشرت إليها، وشكرا جزيلا.
Thank you for those remarks, Algeria. I'll hand the floor to Humanity and Inclusion.
Thank you very much to the entire panel for a very inspiring intervention. I would like to just take a moment to unpack one of Dr. Wild's comment made at the very beginning related to the understanding of our sector of the notion of preventable deaths. Our focus, as Dr. Wild has outlined, has been very much on risk education and land release as a way to prevent death. But we have thus far done very little when it comes to giving attention to preventing the death of those people for whom land release came too late, or for whom explosive ordnance risk education just simply didn't do the job of keeping them safe. And, you know, I think for too many years, we have really not engaged in victim assistance. And I think, as we all know here in the room, the very first step of victim assistance is to help a person who's injured become a survivor. Because as the figures have shown, far too often, a person just doesn't actually become a survivor. Hence, Handicap International's focus on really separating the term victim, not only from victim to survivor, but also to articulate a person injured, because it's not a given a person that's injured becomes a survivor. And it's my hope that with today's panel, and of course the adoption of the International Mine Action Standard on victim assistance in mine action, that we will actually see a massive raise in the interest of the mine action sectors and the willingness to really engage in all aspects of victim assistance. And as such, I really hope that there will be a shift in consciousness that will lead to the sector to expand its understanding and actions to understanding preventable death, that we can do much more than land release and explosive ordnance risk education to reduce preventable deaths. And I think today's panel was a really good push in the right direction. So thank you very much. I forgot to say my name. My name is Elke Hattentad, and indeed I work with Humanity and Inclusion. Thank you.
Mali, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci aux différents panélistes qui ont vraiment fait des présentations de qualité. J'ai plutôt un commentaire que des questions. Il s'agit de se pencher sur une partie du continent africain, qui est la partie Sahel, notamment le Mali, où l'utilisation abusive des engins explosifs improvisés font des victimes à la fois civiles et militaires. Dans un tel contexte de conflit, les premiers risques de mortalité pour les victimes d'engins explosifs sont relatifs à la disponibilité et non des premiers secours pour stabiliser les victimes et à la capacité de les transporter vers les centres de santé de référence ou des hôpitaux au niveau régional. Ces défis sont particulièrement importants pour les zones rurales et reculées. L'appui au renforcement des capacités des agents de santé communautaire au premier secours pour les victimes d'engins explosifs improvisés pourrait augmenter fortement les chances de survie de ces victimes. Et c'est ça que nous avons expérimenté un moment, courant 2021-2022. Pour 2022, nous avons 59% des victimes qui ont survécu à leurs blessures. De même, la pré-identification avec les communautés des moyens de transport gardés à disposition et la formation à l'utilisation adaptée de brancards permettrait d'améliorer grandement la rapidité du transfert vers les centres de santé. Pour les cas graves, le déplacement des victimes est plus compliqué et requiert les capacités accrues des hôpitaux régionaux pour pouvoir déployer des équipes capables de stabiliser et de déplacer les victimes. Les pays n'ont pas les mêmes réalités, les pays n'ont pas les mêmes capacités. Donc, nous essayons de contextualiser les prises en charge, les premiers secours en fonction des moyens dont on dispose. Et ça nous a permis d'atteindre des résultats probants. Et pour 2021-2022, il y a eu beaucoup de survivants suite aux blessures. Donc, il est important que nous ayons un regard accru sur cette partie de l'Afrique, notamment la région Sahel, pour les prises en charge afin de diminuer les taux de mortalité. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. We are close to at time, so I will pass the floor briefly to Carmen.
Thank you so much. It's difficult to be brief with such an interesting topic, but because mental health and psychosocial support was mentioned a number of times, and try not to repeat, I'll just highlight a few things. I really appreciate finally the final remarks on your presentation, talking very directly about the CRPD. So my first comment is to remind all of us here that the CRPD also recognizes psychosocial disabilities as an essential part of its role. So maybe reminding all of us that the stigma and discrimination that was mentioned in the panel is even double if we have the stigma related to a physical disability, and then the very heavy stigma that is carried when a person has psychosocial disability or mental health condition. In that regard, I would encourage all of these mechanisms to include a center person's approach. And for example, initiatives like Quality Rights from WHO are a very good getaway to understanding the rights of persons with psychosocial disability and how to integrate that on services. I would just echo Dr. Wild in saying that there are tools, there are mechanisms. We have a lot of ways in which we can integrate the mental health and well-being care that is necessary for survivors. So we can do that efficiently. And once more, I put the service of the IFRC, WHO, and the reference group to share those resources and to input on how we can train. Finally, just because mortality has been mentioned quite a lot, I would like to maybe bring the important notion that deaths are also often due to suicide. And we know we have much higher rates of suicide and suicide attempts among persons with disabilities. So, and the more traumatic the cause of disability, the higher the risk. So to also call for the integration of suicide, because it's something we shouldn't be afraid of talking about and training about. So basically just to say that I love everybody is having mental health and psychosocial support in their minds while we're talking about rights. So let's integrate MHPSS from a rights perspective and not only from a health perspective. And I thank you so much, all panelists, for a wonderful session.
Thank you. We are at time, but we have one more from the floor for us.
Thank you very much. Just one question. I know we're behind. To all the panelists, and especially Giles, and in places where it's far away from any healthcare center, in relation to how to survive that traumatic accident, is there anything that one could do beyond the usual first aid, pre-hospital care, tourniquet and all of that? Is there anything else that we didn't think of that realistically would be available to do in a rural, remote area in order to increase that level of survivorship that colleagues talked about? Thank you.
I'll give the floor to you, Giles, to answer that, and perhaps do an overarching reflection before I close the panel.
I know I have minus 10 minutes to make a quick comment. Actually, I wanted to make a call to action and something I hope is a positive end to this. There needs to be a larger discussion among the humanitarian community about how we support persons with disabilities, both those pre-war and those caused by conflict. There is a lack of communication between organizations. There is often a fragmented response to people's healthcare. And I think the most important thing we can all do is communicate, collaborate, find ways to work together to give people a pathway from injury to a full life. What I would call now, next, and future. Now being the CCCC emergency response, next being the initial support from organizations like HI to provide prosthesis, rehabilitation. And then the final stage, the often neglected stage, is about helping people to live a full life. And when you have a child who's injured at 6 years old, that could be 60 years of support that's needed. And that all needs to be coordinated. And as I say, that is a larger humanitarian conversation. But there's an opportunity for the mine action world to be the cornerstone of that response, because often they are the first point of contact. And so here is an opportunity to be the first point of contact, to help to coordinate that now, next, future response, to make sure that people don't just survive landmine injuries, but go on to live full and fulfilled lives. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, let me close this session and thank the distinguished panelists for their insightful contributions. And thank you all for your attention and participation. Thanks.